This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm.
And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. All this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and today I'm joined by a very special guest from across the network, from Earl Grey. It's Justin Oser. Hi, Justin. It's good to see you. How are you?
Hi, great to be here. You know, I've loved Primitive Culture ever since it debuted. I've listened to all the episodes, and it's just wonderful to be guesting on this show.
Oh, that's nice to hear that from you. It's great to have you on the show. It's been a while. I feel like I'm always saying this whenever we have a guest on. It's been a while setting these things up. I don't know why. I guess often because what happens is guests from across the network, they come to us with ideas, and then we have to sometimes there's something that we've been thinking of doing already, in which case it's fairly straightforward. Sometimes it's something that's totally off our radar, and then we have to kind of get our heads around it. And that was certainly the case with the conversation that we had. This is probably going back quite a few months now, about this episode, which basically Justin came to me and he said there was something he really wanted to look at, which was the relationship between Star Trek and the TV series MASH. Now, I have to say, until this week, and I said this on Twitter and people literally couldn't believe this, until 2 days ago, in fact, I'd never seen a single episode of MASH. I was familiar with it. I'd seen clips on, on other shows and so on. So I was kind of vaguely aware of what it was, but I literally had never actually sat down and watched an episode. And so just to forestall any disappointment on the part of our listeners, because I know, judging by when I put this tweet out, we got such a response from people. I'm getting the sense that this is a pretty big deal and that this show meant a lot to a lot of people, including you, Justin. But what I said was, I don't have time to go and watch the whole of MASH right now. That's something I might do at some point in the future. But my idea was to just focus on a couple of episodes, because there are a couple of episodes that I was aware that kind of tie into DS9 in quite an interesting way, and particularly into the character of Nog. And so that's kind of what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at the way that these kind of MASH stories impact on Nog in particular, in a couple of those episodes, in the cards, and also Treachery, Faith, and the Great River. So that was kind of my compromise. So for anyone listening thinking they want a kind of full retrospective on 11 seasons of MASH, you're going to be disappointed, because I've only seen those 2 episodes plus like 1 or 2 extra ones that I squeezed in. But putting all that aside, I mean, maybe Justin, just to me, who's a complete MASH newbie, you obviously, this is something that you are quite passionate about. It's a part of your childhood or your fandom or whatever. Maybe you could just talk me through a little bit what it is about that show that means so much to you, what it is that made you think it would be something that you'd like to come and talk about.
MASH is something that at this point I've seen like 3 or 4 times all the way through the 250 something episodes. I mean, that's how much I really enjoy it. And I enjoy kind of the juxtaposition of the humor in the show with the drama and kind of the moral and ethical dilemmas. So there's something similar to that with Star Trek, even though the setting and the way that it's done is very different. There's kind of that nice mix of humor, but also the dramatic and, moral dilemmas that you need to think about. Now, the ones we'll be talking about today aren't necessarily typical episodes, but they have some connections with those DS9 episodes. But it's something actually that I hadn't seen until maybe 13 or 14 years ago. So I didn't really see it growing up. I'd maybe seen a few episodes, and it was kind of, I saw it on TV, and the laugh track and all of that, it just wasn't gelling for me. But more recently, after I met my wife, we were able to see it on DVD and it has an option to see it to see the episodes without the laugh track, and somehow that kind of got me, and I was just really fascinated by the whole show and just, watched it a number of times through. We're doing another rewatch now, so it's something like Star Trek where I've seen it quite a bit, and I really enjoy what it was going for.
And it can keep giving, you can keep going back to it and you keep getting something new out of it, obviously. I mean, It's interesting what you're saying about the laugh track, because Justin advised me. I managed to get these episodes on DVD, and Justin told me, take the laugh track off, don't watch with the laugh track. And I was actually in two minds. I started off doing that, and partly I found it slightly odd because occasionally you could tell people were pausing for a laugh that wasn't coming, and that made me feel slightly uncomfortable. And also I think, as someone who is new to the show, I actually found it quite disorienting not having it. Anyway, I kept flipping back and forth, basically. And in some ways, I found the laughter was helpful because it gave a bit of extra energy to the show somehow. And it gave a kind of, and I suppose the episodes that we're looking at are very comic episodes. I mean, I understand MASH went in sort of more dramatic directions as well. And of course, I was also sort of aware, Justin, you were saying to me, these are not necessarily typical MASH episodes in some ways. They might not be the ones that you would choose to introduce someone to this show. But then I was thinking, actually, these are not typical Deep Space Nine episodes that we're looking at. I mean, In the Cards, for example, is a very atypical Deep Space Nine episode. It's also, in the midst of real kind of high drama, and DS9's kind of most, it's on the cusp of the kind of, what I would say is the sort of, is my favorite arc in DS9, that kind of, from, A Call to Arms through to Sacrifice of Angels, real kind of high drama there. And it's a very light, quite sort of, I was going to say flimsy, but it's quite a sort of, it's almost like a sort of confection. Do you know what I mean? It's a kind of, it's an enjoyable, little, sort of almost insignificant story. It's a very small story. The stakes of the story are seemingly very small. And yet at the same time, it's done well enough that it feels kind of meaningful. It actually has a lot of heart to it. And it actually is, I think, a fantastic episode. But that would be a very strange episode of Deep Space Nine. I was aware if you were going to say to someone who'd never seen Star Trek before, go and watch In the Cards, they might. It would be an odd way to introduce the show to it.
It would be. And I think there's a lot of context you need in order to really enjoy that episode. You can't jump in as the first one. Like if you haven't seen any DS9, it would be like, what is going on with this?
Yeah. Sure. And it absolutely relies on affection for these characters, knowing these, knowing them and their kind of foibles and so on. And it's one of those shows that I always think, DS9 could do this so well because it was so character focused. They could do these episodes where, really the kind of love of those characters sort of sold it almost, so it's not just about Jake and Nog in that instance. It's also about all the other characters and kind of their odd, quirky, bizarre, needs that they have in that situation, even to the extent of Bashir's teddy bear, which is frankly kind of ludicrous. And I was looking through the DS9 companion this week and, some of the writers were sort of saying they couldn't quite believe that they kind of got that in there because they thought it was so silly, this idea that he wants his teddy bear back. But, it kind of worked for me.
That's one part of the episode that I don't like because Nog breaks into Lita's quarters while she's sleeping and takes it. I'm like, that's creepy, That's just the one. I mean, I love that episode so much, but that's the one part where I was like, if I could take anything out.
Yeah. The funny thing for me is In the Cards is an episode that I did not like at all on first viewing. I mean, I first saw DS9 in first run. I was a teenager at the time. I was totally into the kind of Dominion War arc. I was into the big drama, into the big stakes and everything. And I saw that episode as a complete waste of time. And I just didn't, it didn't mean anything to me. I didn't get it. I just thought, what do they think they're doing? They're just sort of pissing around when they should be getting on with the story. This is real kind of time wasting. But watching it, as an adult, it has a completely different effect on me. And I don't know whether I was watching it this week and I was thinking, why is that? Is it partly, is it partly not being so wrapped up in the kind of, serialized narrative now that we know where it's going and then we know that it's all there and so on. So you can kind of afford to have these digressions. Or is it also that somehow the stakes in that episode, as I say, they seem very small, but basically the sense we get in the Cards is at the beginning, everyone is very depressed. They're very fatalistic. They're very kind of, the mood is very low. Odo says that thefts are up on the promenade and so on. There's this kind of real, just sort of depressive state of mind hanging over everyone. And by the end of it, through these quite silly gestures really on the part of Jake and Nog, Sisko has this log at the end and he says a new spirit has swept through the station. Nothing practically really has changed except, Worf's got his music and Bashir's got his teddy bear and so on, but suddenly everyone's mood has lifted. And I was wondering, is that partly just, as an adult, that you have to have kind of been through life and kind of experienced disappointment and experienced kind of, unhappiness, and to really appreciate that idea that, these kind of small gestures can actually mean something. And in the bleakest of times, you can take some kind of positivity or some kind of hope from these quite small things. And after all, in some ways, that's what Star Trek is. It's kind of offering you that kind of glimmer of hope in these dark times.
And I wonder if there is something to that, because, actually, the first time that I ever saw DS9 was only about 4 years ago as an adult. And I've always loved that episode. And the way that I saw it at the time was, these are characters that we love. I love that there's some fun in this episode, and that there's something you can see to bolster their spirits right before the war really starts. So in a way, it's important in making sure that they're at a place that they can maybe better handle it, when it gets there.
It's kind of a palate cleanser almost, isn't it? It's sort of like saying, okay, this is just going to sort of clear the air somehow before we go in for the real, big drama somehow. But reading through the DS9 companion as well, they sort of talk about the fact that because it's that kind of penultimate episode of the season, no one really expects much from that episode. And they were sort of saying as the writers could kind of get away with whatever they wanted. And hence they could do this quite silly episode. And even, pushing it with, there's that lions and tigers and bears, oh my joke, which is
lions and tigers and bears,
exactly. Kind of cringy humor, really.
I think they were like, I can't believe we got that in there. Yeah,
I know, exactly. That's the thing. But they
I
were
smile
really
at
just
it.
going to push it. Yeah, it's this is not my favorite moment of the episode, but I don't know, but I sort of appreciate the fact that they've gone so far. And also, the other thing I love about that episode is you have this whole discussion about the economics of the Federation, and Jake actually directly quoting Captain Picard in First Contact. And this is an episode I think was written by Ron Moore, who of course wrote First Contact, but he's like sending up his own material here and basically, making a joke out of it. I don't know. I love that. I just love this sort of playfulness of it. But it did strike me, and obviously I haven't seen a lot of MASH. I've only seen these kind of early episodes, and I know that the show, from what I've read about it, changed a lot as it kind of went on and so on. But I think it's one of the things that I love about Deep Space Nine is I think of all the Star Trek series, it's the one with the kind of greatest drama. It's the one with the highest stakes and the kind of, it's the dark series, it's the gritty series. But it is also, I think, of all the Star Trek series, the one that does comedy the best.
I think so. Yeah.
And in a way, you'd think those two things would be opposed to each other. You'd sort of think it would be, Voyager, which is so kind of light and fluffy in some ways, that would do comedy the best. But somehow it's DS9 that when they go for a comic episode, they absolutely land it. And it's kind of, again, it's to do with those characters, and it's to do with the kind of emphasis on them as people. And somehow they just know how to turn it on. And it's rarely cringy in the way that sometimes when Star Trek does a comedy episode, it can be a little bit cringy. I feel like they because the comedy feels organic, it feels natural, it feels like it sort of comes out of these people that we've got to know, and it's kind of believable, but at the same time it is very funny. And it kind of struck me, thinking about MASH, that there's something of the same thing there, in the kind of idea of trying to do whatever you'd call it, like a tragicomedy or a kind of comedy drama or whatever that sort of genre is, where you're sort of, you are going for the laugh, and there are a lot of laughs in there, but there is also drama in there as well. And it's sort of all baked into the pie somehow.
And just the idea of MASH, that there are these doctors, in a war zone who have to operate on, you don't see it in the episodes that we saw, but typically there's a lot of episodes where there's a lot of casualties, and they have to, do surgery and like all of this serious stuff that's life and death. But somehow they put the comedy in there, and it works in this situation because, like, in a certain way, you may need something that's comic the most when you're in the darkest of situations to just keep you going, right? So in a certain way, it makes sense, but I think it's hard to pull off. But yeah, I think Deep Space Nine does it well. I think there are, other places in Trek that do it well, and I think MASH does it well, and that's one of the things I love, because if it was all like 100% drama, you'd be just like drained, right? There's got to be something to lift it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's true, even with theatre or with anything, actually. I mean, if you think particularly of theatre, even the darkest, sort of grittiest, most serious of plays, usually they have the odd joke in there somewhere. And you almost need that. I mean, and even, some of the darkest, grittiest Deep Space Nine episodes, there's going to be, a line in there that kind of breaks the tension. There's going to be a sort of moment. And I think that we need that sort of balance, to kind of make these things work. But it's definitely an interesting question, like how do you kind of where does that line fall? But I guess just in terms of the episodes that we're thinking of, the main one for MASH really, I think, is the episode For Want of a Boot, which is a second season, I think, episode.
Yeah.
And basically this is the episode where Hawkeye has got a hole in his boots. He needs some new boots. And the story of the episode is basically how's he going to get his boots. And funnily enough, one of the things that made me think that, while they were writing in the cards, they must have been thinking of this is there's even a point in the cards where Nog says to Jake, because they're trying to get hold of this baseball card and it's not going well. He says, couldn't you get your dad a new pair of shoes instead? And I couldn't help thinking that must be a reference to this MASH episode where the whole, where the stakes are not the baseball card, it's a pair of boots. It's something kind of even more mundane, in fact, but totally kind of, it's a MacGuffin, I suppose. And that's the thing with all these episodes is it's like really the thing that they're trying to get is incidental to the kind of process that is involved and the ingenuity that's involved to getting there. I mean, in Treachery, Faith and the Great River, which we might come on to talk about a bit later, they're trying to get this gravity generator or whatever it is. We don't ever see it. We don't even see the defiance of it, I think, in that episode. It's completely beside the point, really. It's just the MacGuffin. It's the thing that is, we have to be told is the kind of focus of all the attention somehow. So in For Want of a Boot, it's a new boot. And the whole of the episode involves this quite elaborate sequence of trades and negotiations and arrangements that Hawkeye goes through in order to try and get that boot, basically.
Yeah. I mean, so what I found interesting comparing, the MASH episodes with the DS9 episodes is that in these MASH episodes, we'll talk about For Want of a Boot first. Like in the end, he does all these trades. It seems like it's working, but then somebody doesn't want to go along and it falls through. He doesn't actually get his boot. And there's this, funny bit where he's like walking around with a golf bag on his shoe as a shoe. So I think that can be typical of MASH, where it's like you're trying to do these things. And part of it happens because of the bureaucracy. It's like, I have a hole in my boot. I ordered them weeks ago, but there's all this bureaucracy in the army. I don't know if they're going to get it right. I don't know if I'll ever get it. So I need to go through this crazy thing to try to get it. But he doesn't succeed. Whereas in, the Deep Space Nine episodes, they do succeed. They get the baseball card. They get what they need for the gravity generator and all that. So it's interesting in MASH that it's more pessimistic. Like, what can you do? There's nothing you can do. And in Deep Space Nine, it's like, it may seem like we're on thin ice for a while, but we're going to get there. Trust us, we're going to get there. And they do, right? In both episodes, really. They do, absolutely. And certainly in the cards, I talked about how when I was a teenager watching this episode, it did nothing to me. I can't watch that episode now without crying at the end of it. I mean, it sounds ridiculous because it's such a sort of silly episode, but, they pull something out of the bag. And that final scene, just that montage of everyone, going about their day, just, and it being slightly better as a result of what Jake and Nog have done. Lita. Except Lita, that's true. I know.
Poor
She's
Lita.
Not happy. Yeah, because they even have this shot where it's like, where is my teddy bear?
I know. No, you're right. Well, someone has to suffer, but someone has to suffer, and in this instance, it's Lita. But I mean, everyone else is just, I don't know, it's just happier. And also, I think, in the episode, it ends on this hug between Jake and Sisko, and it's just such a sweet
it is
moment. And it's so nice, and Jake says in the episode, I just want to do something for him. He's always doing stuff for me. And of course, that's what we've seen throughout, whatever it is, 5 seasons of DS9 by this point, is Ben being very protective of Jake and so on. And other than, obviously The Visitor was, obviously the other big episode where Jake did something massive for Ben. And, in some ways, maybe there's a weird sort of, I don't know, echo of that there. But for me, that kind of final montage really always gets me these days because it's so kind of heartfelt. And you're right, it's completely the opposite of the MASH episode where it ends in farce. The whole thing kind of falls apart. Basically, everyone's made these presents, everyone's made these promises, and gradually one person goes back and then the next person does, and the next one. I just made a little list of what they are. Basically, for anyone who hasn't seen the MASH episode, to give you an idea. So Hawkeye, who's the Alan Alda character, I'm sure you will probably know this better than I do. He needs his boots. The guy who's got the boots, who's what I guess like the quartermaster or something, the guy in the stores anyway, says he needs to see the dentist urgently, although he's not at the top of the list. The dentist wants to go on a trip to Japan. The commanding officer who could send the dentist to Japan someone else has written a report saying negative things about him, and he wants it to be blocked. The woman who's written the report agrees to not send it if they throw a party for her lover, boyfriend, whatever.
Yeah, pretty
the guy
much.
she's sort of having an affair with, who everyone hates. And then that involves trying to get these kind of popular girls to come to the party, and one of them wants a hairdryer. So it's exactly the same kind of, sequence of crazy trades and so on. And in some ways, I suppose it falls somewhere between in the cards, where literally it's like a shopping list that they've been given and they have to tick off each item on the list.
And I love that guy and his like cellular entertainment chamber. I think
he's fantastic.
It's great.
Yeah.
But yeah, they have like this laundry list, like, oh, can you get me this, and this? And it's like, it's going to take a while, but yeah. But
there's also, even in For Want of a Boot, there's also that sense that you see in Treachery, Faith and the Great River of each trade is contingent on the next one. And, you know, that kind of, the kind of craziness of the situation when O'Brien is saying to Nog at one point, I think, so if we give this to this person, then they'll get that. And Nog says, well, that's a rumor. There's a rumor that they might have it. And it's like everything is reliant on this huge chain of trades. Basically.
I mean, it's a house of cards, really.
Well, I was going to say it's a bit like if you've ever had to try and buy a house, it's the same thing. It's like being caught in a chain and like 3 links down the chain, someone decides not to go through with it and the whole thing, falls apart. But yeah, exactly. It's kind of a house of cards. It's a kind of, that's where part of the comedy comes from, is the sort of absurdity of this train. And of course, in the MASH episode, it goes wrong at the end. And then everyone, once they don't get what they've been offered, goes back on what they've promised.
Yeah. And that says something interesting. Like they only want, and that's the case in the MASH episode and in the DS9 episodes. Like everybody wants something. There's nobody who's like, you know what? I've worked with you for a while. I'm going to do you this favor. Everybody wants something. And as soon as they don't get it, forget about it. It's not going to happen. And it's like, wow, that's really saying something about how things work in both of the universes of this show. Like, and how humans generally work. Like, if I'm going to go out of my way, you need to do something for me. Although that's not 100% of the way that things go, because I think everyone's had an experience where they ask something from somebody and they're like, here you go. No problem. I won't ask anything in return. You've done other things for me. I want to help you with this. No problem. But in these episodes, like, in order for it to work, it has to be this for that in order for it to keep going. But life isn't always like that, right? Sometimes people will give you just something, right?
One of the bits that I like, though, I think that is true. Yeah, absolutely. And certainly in the cards, it very much hinges on this idea that like everyone can be bought, basically. Yeah. It's a very kind of Ferengi idea. Nog says he's going to give Jake a lesson in incentive-based economics. Basically, the idea that, everyone has a price, essentially, if you can work out what people want. And it's interesting because Jake sort of tries to get on board with it, doesn't he? And because they offer O'Brien some time in the holosuite by doing him a favor, some boring job that he's supposed to be doing. And then he sort of tries to do the same thing with Bashir and says, wouldn't you rather be somewhere else? And Bashir's like, no, I'm doing exactly what I want, and Jake's a bit stumped because he's like, he's failed to really learn the lesson that Nog's teaching, which is, you've got to, he's like they're interesting, these episodes, because they take all the kind of characteristics of the Ferengi, being these kind of wheeler dealers, being these kind of trade, you sort of used car salesman type, skills in a way, but put a positive spin on it. So he's sort of using them for good rather than Quark trying to basically rip people off. But it's definitely based on that idea of, if you can find out what it is that someone wants, then you need to sort of get to understand them in order to work out how to manipulate them. And I was going to say the exception to what you're saying about it being tit for tat and everyone wants something is O'Brien, because actually the way they get what they want with O'Brien is they offer it as a gift. They ask O'Brien for what they want. He basically says, no. And then they come back and they say, why don't we help you out with this or whatever? You go and do your thing. And then they say, about those things that we asked for. And O'Brien's like, oh yeah, sure. I'll sort it out for you. So there isn't explicitly this idea of a tit for tat.
Well, but he is doing it for the...
It's not a trade exactly. No, I know, but it's like with O'Brien, it feels like almost they've kind of gone around the side of making it less explicit. So it seems like it's more like, I'll rub your back, you rub mine kind of thing. Okay. Here, let me do you a favor. Oh, about that other thing. Oh yeah, sure. But it's not as explicitly a trade. So it's not something that he can go back on in the same way as in the MASH episode. Everyone can basically say, well, you haven't fulfilled your part of the deal. Therefore, there's no way I'm giving you what you're asking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could totally see that.
But actually that raises a sort of interesting question in some ways. I think I was listening. I mentioned to you, Justin, when I was, because when we were talking about MASH and what our ideas about MASH were, and I said to you, I don't know much about MASH, but I have always been a big fan of Alan Alda. I've always thought he was great in everything I've seen him in. And obviously this is the main, thing that he's known for. I'd never really seen it. And I think he is definitely for me, he's what made those episodes watchable. And the two MASH episodes that we looked at, the other one is an episode called it's called The Price of Tomato Juice, something about tomato juice. Price of Tomato Juice, yeah. And it's basically the same kind of thing, only the character Radar is doing all these trades to try and get some tomato juice for their CO. And I felt like in that episode, it just didn't work in the same way. And I think a large part of that is down to kind of Alan Alda's sort of charisma and the charm of his character and his kind of exactly that kind of wheeler dealer, sort of slightly roguish quality, because it's interesting. My sense anyway, from, obviously only having seen a handful of MASH episodes, is he's not the most likable guy necessarily. Hawkeye. He seems like a bit of a jerk in a way, but at the same time, he's very watchable. He's very kind of appealing. He's very sort of charismatic. And funnily enough, one of the things I said to you is, because we were talking about Alan Alda, and I said, did you know that he does this podcast now? He does a podcast called Clear and Vivid. He's like, 80 something now, I think, and he's just launched his own podcast basically. But he's a big into communication, so on. So his podcast is all about like connecting with people and communicating and so on. And I was listening to an episode this week, which was quite interesting, about empathy. And he was talking to this guy who'd written a book about arguing against the overuse of empathy, in a sense, which is quite a sort of controversial position to take. And what Alan Alda was saying was that the way he saw it, empathy was a sort of skill that could be used in a good way or a bad way. And the bad way, what he was talking about in terms of dark empathy, was exactly the kind of used car salesman, the unscrupulous salesman, the kind of Ferengi who comes in and gets to know someone, works out what it is that they want, kind of really understands the other person, but not from a position of genuinely trying to help them, but from a position of like, how can I get what I want out of this person? How can I sort of use this person? And I suppose there's that element there with Nog that, in both these DS9 episodes, particularly actually in Treachery, Faith and the Great River, there's this sense that, Nog can do things that O'Brien can't do, both in terms of, these kind of elaborate trades and things that O'Brien would never do, such as trading his commanding officer's desk and taking these kind of risks that could potentially ruin his career, or selling Martok's blood wine or whatever, which could get him in really sticky situation. But there's also this sense that Nog can...
I was going to say, and I love how Nog is like, oh, just give me your authorization code. It'll make it easier for this. And then he uses it like 5 or 6 times for other things.
He totally abuses it, basically. But so he's going to do what he needs to. A very DS9 kind of attitude, character who kind of skirts the sort of ethics in a way. But also he is going to... It's not just that. It's also his kind of understanding of people. So as he says to O'Brien, I have to get to know the quartermaster. I know his wife's name. I know his kids' names. I know what they're like. It's this kind of like exactly that idea of getting to know someone, but ultimately he's only doing all of this like the used car salesman to get what he needs. Just the same way that Quark would, except that Nog is in Starfleet. He's doing it for the right reasons. And funnily enough, it reminded me of another MASH episode that I was watching just sort of by the by in preparation for this, which was the very second episode, like the first episode after the pilot, which came up in relation to this because there's this issue of the desk, and it's an episode in which Hawkeye and his friend, who I can never... What's his friend's name?
Oh, in the first season, you're thinking of Trapper.
Right, okay, yeah. Anyway, they're trying to get some medicine, and they end up trading their commanding officer's desk, and the comedy is like how they're going to get it out of his office, and it's very funny. They end up taking the wall down of the like hut that the office is in and taking it out that way, and it goes off on a helicopter. It's all quite mad and crazy. But actually, that's an episode where, yes, there's this kind of wheeler-dealering aspect to some extent. Yes, they're kind of slightly shady. They're trading on the black market and so on, but they're actually doing it in order to get some medicine that they need to treat their patients. So again, there's that kind of idea of they're sort of the greater good. They're on the right side of things, even if their conduct is a bit shifty.
I mean, and again, in that episode, it's because of the bureaucracy. Like, I think they were supposed to get this medicine, this hydrocortisone, but there was some screw up and they didn't get it, and they got something else, and they're like, oh, we need this right away because we're out. So they're willing to do what they need to help save lives. But I think, like in MASH especially, there's this idea that there's this bureaucracy that's keeping them from doing what they need to, which is to help people and save lives, which is something a little bit different than what's going on in DS9, where it's... Although I guess in Treachery, Faith and the Great River, there is this like 3-week waiting list because of the bureaucracy, and they're going to find their way to the top of the list. So I guess there is that.
Yeah, and Sisko needs to take the Defiant out. That's potentially going to save lives. There's kind of the stakes are.
Although it's more like inconvenience. It's like, well, I don't want while we're out there for the gravity to be a little dodgy. It's not like life or death, but it's still important to him.
That's true. You're right. You mean he could go without it? Yeah, that
potentially.
Is true. And there is that kind of sense of Sisko as the kind of slightly intimidating boss, and no one wants to get in trouble with him. And kind of like perish the thought they've lost his desk, and what are they going to do in that situation? Whereas actually in the MASH episode, the guy in charge seems a bit kind of. He's not really a figure of great authority, right? He's a bit of a fool in a way.
Yeah. So in the first 3 seasons, the CO is Colonel Blake, and he's not really intimidating to anyone. He's kind of being manipulated a lot of times by people. But the one that you saw, the Price of Tomato Juice, which is in season 4, has Colonel Potter, who's much more intimidating figure. But definitely Blake in that episode. Because what happens is basically they take his desk and it's gone, and it's like, well, what are you going to do? That's the black market. And of course, it never comes up again. But whereas in Treachery, Faith, and the Great River, it's like, we better get this thing back or Sisko's going to be really angry and heads are going to roll because he's super intimidating.
Yeah. He is absolutely, and it's also the desk that they end up with in the meantime is so pathetic. It's like it looks like it's going to come from IKEA or something.
I know, it's this tiny.
It's really
white
unimpressive
desk.
little desk. Yeah. I love that idea in that episode as well, that they mentioned this guy's taking pictures behind Captain Picard's desk as well. This kind of fan who's kind of working his way through. I want to see
that story where he sneaks into Picard's ready room and takes a picture behind his desk.
But it's almost like, I guess, I mean, like if you go to, Star Trek Las Vegas or something, you can go and sit on the bridge, or, you can have these photos done. It's kind of like living that sort of fantasy, right? Of okay, here's me in the captain's chair. Here's me behind the desk. It's, I don't know, there's something quite charming about that idea. I found that very funny. But I think it's interesting when we look at these ideas of these stories kind of influencing each other and cropping up, whether MASH has influenced DS9 or whatever, that, they're also stories that can be kind of repeated. I mean, arguably, Treachery, Faith, and the Great River has a lot in common within the cards. And it's even, the same character, Nog, who's kind of doing the same kinds of things again. And obviously in MASH, they basically haven't exactly rehashed the same story, but it's very similar structurally, The Price of Tomato Juice, to For the Want of a Boot. And again, there's this kind of the same element that it ends. He goes through all these kind of hoops to try and get this tomato juice. And he does get it at the end. He gets it. He gives it to the CO, and the CO says, "Oh, sorry, I can't drink it. I forgot I'm allergic to it." It's this ridiculous idea that at the start of the episode, he said, "Oh, wow, tomato juice. I love it. I love it so much." And then it turns out that he drank it and it made him really ill. And then he's like, "Yeah, I'm never touching that again." So again, the whole thing was for nothing. So there's this kind of sort of bathos almost of like, all this kind of build up, these kind of ridiculous levels of jumping through the hoops and kind of, and going to these great extent, all for absolutely nothing. It all falls apart one way or another.
And I think that, I mean, in a way that gets at the core of something in MASH, which is that, I mean, first of all, this is about the Korean War, which lasted 3 years, and there's 11 seasons about this, right? It goes on much longer than the war itself. And there's a certain sense in MASH in which you can have like momentary happiness, but it never lasts. And in the end, things won't work out. And also, it's I think it's a metaphor for the whole war. It's like they fought this war and basically ended up where they had started, with Korea divided in half. And now 65 years later, there isn't even an official peace treaty, right? So there's this sense, and it was also meant to be a commentary on Vietnam at the time, like, people are dying, all of this is happening, what's it for? It's for nothing. And so even within those episodes, it's like, we did all of this stuff, but really there was only like a momentary thrill out of it. It was all for nothing. Whereas on Deep Space Nine, I think part of the reason why things work out is because they are, in the course of the series, trying to do something to defend Federation ideals, and especially during the course of the Dominion War, they're trying to make sure that the Federation doesn't get taken over by the Dominion, and all of these atrocities and brutalities that will probably happen. There's a sense that they're doing it for something, and so I think it makes sense in the 2 episodes that things do work out in the end, because as much as people, talk about DS9 as being dark and gritty, I think that ultimately, like, if you look at the whole arc of the show, where it started out as, the Cardassians have destroyed a lot of Bajor's infrastructure and inflicted a lot of these things on the people. The station itself is in shambles. If you look at that and then go toward the end, they've fought this successful war. They're going to go forward into the future. There's a sense that at a certain point Bajor is going to join the Federation. So actually, it's kind of like there are these episodes or periods of time of darkness, but ultimately it's a hopeful message if you just go from the first episode to the very, I mean, even though, of course, like in the last episode, hundreds of millions of people die, which is not good and not hopeful, but like in a certain way, they've turned the corner and it's going to be something much better than where they started at the beginning. Whereas in MASH, it's kind of like, in the end of it, the best thing you can get out of it is just going home, right? But what have you really gotten out of it? Lots of people died. These people lost years off of their lives being in the conflict and all of that. So there's a sense like that I think permeates the show that a lot of it's kind of for nothing except for the experiences that they have with each other and the friendships and the bonds that they make and the few people they are able to save. I feel like it's like they're using the same kind of story in a very different way. And I think there's a reason why in one case it doesn't work out and in the other case it does.
That's interesting. Although DS9 does have that kind of bleakness at the end. I mean, I'm thinking of, in What You Leave Behind, of that idea, that whole thing about they're going to drink the crate of blood wine or whatever, and they end up pouring it on the ground because there's that sense. And the female changeling says, your victory will taste as bitter as defeat or something like that, doesn't she? That idea that, ultimately no one comes out of a war like that winning, in a sense, like there are no winners in some way. So, I take your point that in terms of they're very much on the right side of this. It's very much the kind of the just war that they're fighting, if you know what I mean, in DS9. It's definitely, there's the danger they might lose it, but there's certainly no question that it needs to be fought in a sense. It was interesting what you're saying though about this sense of the Korean War in MASH. I mean, I was thinking if I didn't know that show was set during the Korean War, I don't think from any of the episodes that I've watched, and I have watched about 4 or 5 of them this week, it could have been anywhere. Do you know what I mean? Like it was so much of it is so unspecific. And maybe that's realistic to the kind of day-to-day life of people in that situation. I mean, I know it's a kind of drama comedy, but is it on one level a situation comedy? That's the situation. But it certainly doesn't always impinge on the kind of story. But then you could say the same about Deep Space Nine, that, the kind of serialized story doesn't always impinge on what's going on from week to week. Sometimes it has nothing to do with it. It's kind of, that's just the setting in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting just hearing your experience just from a few episodes, because, I mean, I think there are certain episodes where it's very clear where it's very clear that it's taking place during the Korean War because of the specific story, and you could only have that kind of story in that context. Sure. But at the same time, I think they were going for something that would be commentary on the Vietnam War at the time, but probably also a commentary on any war, that there's going to be, lives that end, lives that are irrevocably changed, and that you could, because, I mean, I guess you could look at that setting and be like, well, maybe that could be any war. I mean, you can place it in a certain period of time because of the uniforms and the equipment they have and all of that, but it could stand for any war, I guess.
It reminded me when you were saying about, the fact that MASH was set in the Korean War, but taking place during the Vietnam War. The other story that I wanted us to look at in relation to these stories in relation to Nog is Catch-22, which is, a novel by Joseph Heller, which was written, is set during the Second World War and is based, to some very limited extent on Joseph Heller's own experiences as a bombardier in the Second World War, but was written, I think he started writing it in 1953, sort of around that period. So, and then it wasn't published until 1961, but so it was very much informed by the Korean War, even though it was set in the Second World War. And he actually said in interviews, in various places, this doesn't really reflect my feelings about the Second World War at all. I didn't, because the novel is, for anyone who hasn't read it, it's a very, it's a satire, basically. It's a very kind of farcical, crazy, it again taps into a lot of these ideas about where the line between comedy and drama and being able to sort of switch back and forth. It's kind of absurdist, basically. Almost sort of Alice in Wonderland level of absurdity at a lot of times. But it does also have this kind of slightly biting element of satire. And Heller was very keen to emphasize that really the satire, he was not satirizing the forces in the Second World War that ostensibly are what the book is about. He was satirizing the Korean War, which was taking place at the time that he was writing it. So it's kind of interests me, that idea that, a story about one war can really be about another one. But certainly in terms of Nog and in terms of Treachery, Faith and the Great River, although we might see the influence of those MASH episodes in that episode, and certainly the reason I think I suggested this episode to you was because I'd seen a lot of people online saying, oh, it's just like that MASH episode. And by the way, that story was ripped off in Sergeant Bilko and it was ripped off somewhere else. And, MASH ripped it off themselves because they ended up running the same storyline twice. And so in some ways did DS9. But the story that actually the writers of Treachery, Faith and the Great River were thinking about was Catch-22. And if you go again back to the DS9 companion, there's a line in there, David Weddell, who was one of the writers on it. He said, as we were talking about the B story, Ira Stephen Bear obviously said, why don't we just do one where Nog is like Milo Minderbinder? And Milo Minderbinder is the character in Catch-22 who is exactly that kind of wheeler-dealer character, who is the sort of roguish trader who organizes these ludicrous, totally absurd trades, this enormous kind of business empire. He is like a real Ferengi character. He's like, he's turned the war into a kind of profit-making exercise. Very different from Nog in some ways, but in other ways, he does have things in common with him. He's quite young. He's very keen. It's all about, he's very keen to like make a good impression. He's got all these kind of qualities that Nog has, but he's a very interesting character because in some ways he's sort of a lovable rogue. In other ways, he's one of the darkest characters in that book, I think, in a way.
Oh, yeah. It was interesting that you made the suggestion to read Catch-22, which I did for this episode, because, I mean, to be honest, like I found it to be a really dark novel and hard to read at times. And the character of Milo Minderbinder, it is really to a crazy extent. I mean, at one point, he's really like paying the enemy to bomb their own camp, right? And people die because of it. And there's all this stuff that he's doing. And he is really making his own empire. I was just amazed that the lengths Joseph Heller took it to, because like every town that he's in, he's like, the mayor or the sultan or like this person that they feel it should be their leader and totally influential. And he keeps talking about, oh, you all have shares in this. And it's like, where's my share? Here, he writes on a piece of paper, a share. Nobody actually gets anything out of it. But somehow he gets away with all of this stuff like he's a war hero. And there's something also very interesting about it, because he's really trying to monetize the war effort in a way that you don't usually see. But I think that's something that's increasingly happened where, contractors are looking to make money from a war that's going on or conflict that's going on. But he takes it to such an absurd extreme where it's like, if that was the real world, somebody would definitely get like court-martialed for that. But I guess Joseph Heller's trying to make a point that like there is kind of this worship of making money, and taking it to this absurd extreme shows, the extreme that people can go to and how much they can be celebrated for it. Something like that is what I took out of it.
And part of what we see in Catch-22 is that the superior, Colonel Cathcart, totally buys into this idea. Like Milo has completely convinced his superiors that this is the right thing to do, even though it is blatantly unpatriotic. He is basically a war profiteer. He's completely unscrupulous. In some ways, you could say he's the villain of the book, because he does end up with, other major characters in the book dying as a result of his raids. He's bombing his own people. He's sort of subcontracting everything out to one person or another. So he's sort of the point where maybe the book's kind of satirical absurdity in some ways meets reality, because it has real world consequences. But it's also, there's this kind of, one of the things that made me think of Nog as well as this kind of keenness and this sort of desire to impress, and the fact that, his whole thing is about, he wants to set up a mart and he wants to set up a syndicate and he wants to set up all this kind of business empire, this kind of Ferengi attitude, is he has this almost, we see Nog in that episode talking about the Great River and this kind of mystical idea of everything being connected, and this kind of elevating capitalism in a sense to a sort of philosophy of a sort of metaphysical idea of the universe almost. And I think with Milo, there's kind of this sense of the syndicate is this kind of, as you say, it's a setup in which no one ever really gets anything out of it. It's all completely absurd because people end up paying more for things than they are worth, or even there are all these kind of bizarre conversations where he says he's going to make money by buying
like
something
buying
from
and selling
himself.
to himself.
And he's always, I know, but the weird thing is, it all reminded me of like, all the kind of like subprime mortgages, or these things, instruments in the real world. There was a play here in London a few years ago. I don't know, it may have transferred over to the States in the end. I don't know. It was a play about Enron. And it was this very entertaining, very fantastic production. Basically, they had, sort of singing and dancing and people dressed up as velociraptors and all these kind of weird things. But it was kind of trying to get across how mad the kind of trading and the ideas and the kind of financial concepts and instruments involved in all of that kind of crisis were. And it did that again through this kind of absurdity. But you definitely get that sense with Milo of the kind of just the sort of the madness of it all. It's incredibly complicated, just like with Nog making this deal with this person to make a deal with this person to make a deal with the other person based on a rumor that this person somewhere else might offer this and this in exchange. It's sort of absurdly complicated, but it's also sort of, it literally doesn't make sense. It's literally nonsense. It's pure nonsense at some level, which is why I say it's kind of almost Alice in Wonderland level. It's kind of, and I think there's an element of that in Catch-22 is the whole book is sort of built on paradox, really, the kind of the madness of war expressed through almost in every sentence. There's a kind of paradox of some kind or another, that kind of conveys this world in which no one really says what they mean. No one ever really makes sense. The kind of people in charge, it's not just that they make decisions for kind of venal, illogical reasons. It's that there's literally a kind of, I don't know how to express it. There's the sort of topsy-turvy quality to the whole thing. So for example, a character is believed to be dead when he isn't, and then no one will recognize that he's alive, even though he's walking around saying, I'm here, I'm still alive. Yeah. He's certified as dead, and then he goes around.
Paperwork says you're dead, so you must be dead.
It's that kind of, it's sort of Kafkaesque kind of sort of crazy world. And even in the language, there are lines like this joke that comes up several times. I just wrote this line down. These two men are told to take this man outside and shoot him. So the story says, they didn't know what to do. Neither of them had ever taken Major Danby outside and shot him before. So even just like on the most like basic level of what seems like a reasonable statement is followed up by a kind of absurdist statement. So the whole sort of language of the novel is infused with this kind of madness. But in some ways, which obviously is not the case in Deep Space Nine, is not the case there. But there is an element of that, I think, in this idea of the kind of the great river and this kind of mystical element of everything being connected and the kind of commerce being connected in this totally irrational kind of ungraspable way somehow, this kind of system that almost mere mortals can't understand.
I do think it's interesting to know that Catch-22 actually inspired what was in there for Nog and Treachery, Faith, and the Great River, because I feel like they did do something different because, it is a certain like mystical way that he explains it, but there's another way that Nog explains it that makes sense. Every world has too much of one thing and too little of another, which is the basis of trade between countries and presumably could be the basis of trade between worlds. So what he's doing makes a certain amount of sense. I mean, and also, Nog does all of these trades because that's what he's learned and that's what Ferengi do. But just by, being a cadet in Starfleet, he's doing something very different than other Ferengi do, and he's not really going to profit off of it himself, right? And there are other Ferengi that are doing things that can have far more detrimental consequences. But like reading this novel and that character of Milo, like he out Ferengis any Ferengi I think that we've ever seen, right? Because he is, because what's interesting about Deep Space Nine is you get a certain sense, they say war is good for business, peace is good for business, right? But there's a certain point at which, Quark is like, well, look at your history on Earth and all the wars you've been through and all of that. We didn't really go through that. We're just in it for commerce. We're not in it to kill other people, So there's a certain way in which, in comparing themselves with previous people on Earth, there's a certain like moral superiority that they have about it. But Milo, it's kind of like if like everybody's way of thinking about things went completely upside down and they were like, you know what, Milo, you make a lot of sense. We're all about making money. You're doing the best. You're indispensable. Yeah, sure. Some people got killed, but what can you do? That's business. I mean, that's kind of the sense that you get, which is completely ridiculous. But I think it's interesting they were inspired by that because I think they've toned down. I mean, partly because we know who Nog is by season 7, right? But they've toned that way, way, way down. But he is doing like all of these trades and all of this wheeling and dealing. But I feel like, to me, it feels like it's more inspired by MASH, where all of that trading and wheeling and dealing is for a better purpose instead of for your own enrichment, and that can involve other people getting killed,
Absolutely, yeah.
And I wonder also how much like Catch-22 itself inspired MASH, which as a novel came out in 1968, some years later, and I wonder how much it inspired that, but he had a different the author of that book had a different take on it.
Well, I think there's always been a link between those two stories. I mean, partly because I don't know so much about the novel of MASH, but the film I know was released, I think, at the same year as the film of Catch-22. And the film of Catch-22, I have to say, I have watched it this week. I have watched it before. Some people love that film. It's like, it's got all the money thrown at it to kind of recreate the Second World War and all this stuff. It's got an absolute amazing all-star cast. You know, it's got Orson Welles. It's got kind of all kinds of, you know, big stars of the era. For me, it just absolutely doesn't work as a film. And apparently what happened was that the film of MASH, which obviously is not historically as successful as the TV series of MASH that followed it, did much better than the film Catch-22, even though Catch-22 had been a huge bestseller as a novel. And again, there was that sort of idea of, look, here are these two things. There's definitely a similarity. Okay, one is set in the Second World War, one is set in the Korean War, but they both got this kind of tragicomic sensibility, kind of looking at the, you know, the potential comedy of warfare rather than the kind of drama necessarily, but marrying that with the drama as well. And I think the feeling then was that basically when it came to the cinema, MASH had kind of outperformed Catch-22, somehow playing the same game. And obviously then, you know, MASH moved on to the TV and became even more successful as a TV show, much more successful than it was as a film. But so there's definitely, I think, an idea that they're kind of playing in the same sandbox and that there's a kind of, they're not exactly the same. I mean, you know, insofar as Catch-22 is so utterly like divorced from the real world because it's so absurdist. And I mean, even at the very start of the novel, there's a little note from Joseph Heller saying it takes place on this island in Italy called Pianosa. And he says basically the island of Pianosa is tiny and couldn't possibly accommodate all of the stuff that happens in this novel.
Right.
And that is almost like a sort of emblem for the fact that the novel itself is totally, I mean, it's a fat book as well, you know, for such a mad concept. It's quite a long novel.
Oh yeah.
It's,
460 pages. So,
exactly.
So.
It's not a kind of slim volume. It's kind of, you know, it's expansive. It's over the top. It's exaggerated. And everything about it is kind of OTT and sort of goes beyond reality and kind of credibility and so on. But one thing that I do slightly, I don't know whether I entirely agree with you about is when you say that in the DS9 episode that yes, it's true that you were saying that Nog gives two explanations. He gives the kind of mystical explanation and then he gives the kind of practical explanation, which is basically supply and demand. One planet has a surplus of this and a deficit of that, and therefore kind of trading begins. And I suppose what I felt is that, and you get glimpses of this in the DS9 episode because the trades get increasingly elaborate and complicated and sort of ridiculous, is that it's one thing to say that in a kind of, I don't know, sort of pre-industrial society or whatever, yeah, people trade, you know, before you have money, literally you have a barter economy and people trade goods, and that happens on quite a local level and it's quite straightforward and it's quite sort of comprehensible. But arguably, I would say once you get to kind of, you know, 21st century capitalism or 20th century capitalism, the trades that are going on are so elaborate and mysterious. And, you know, in half the time, if you look at like, say, the banking sector, it's trading things that don't really exist. It's trading, you know, like you were saying with Milo writing out a share, you know, it's all about trade. It's not about actual things. It's not about kind of, and even if it is about actual things, it becomes almost meaningless. I was just thought I'd just read to give people an idea about sort of the language of Catch-22 and also particularly in Milo, because I think this emphasizes slightly what I was saying about how not only how elaborate it is, but almost how it almost becomes so complicated that it ceases to sort of mean anything. So this is from a section towards the end of the book where Milo is disingenuously offering to hand over his business to Colonel Cathcart. And basically, he tells Colonel Cathcart everything he's going to need to understand to take over the business. So this is just almost at random from this chapter. He says, and don't forget the galvanized zinc in the warehouse at Flint. 4 carloads of galvanized zinc from Flint must be flown to the smelters in Damascus by noon on the 18th. Terms FOB Calcutta 2%, 10 days EOM. 1 Messerschmitt full of hemp is due in Belgrade for a C-47.5 full of those semi-pitted dates we stuck them with from Khartoum. Use the money from the Portuguese anchovies we're selling back to Lisbon to pay for the Egyptian cotton we've got coming back from Mamaroneck, I don't even know where that is, and to pick up as many oranges as you can in Spain. And it's like this whole chapter goes on basically along these lines until Colonel Cathcart basically gives up and says, look, I can't possibly do this. No one can do this but you, Milo. You're the only man who understands this kind of level of commerce, just because he's got so many trades going to different places and so many things. And you know, he ends up, for example, he overbuys cotton and realizes it's worthless, and then he has to work out what to do with it. And I don't know. I feel like the novel exactly. He starts serving chocolate-covered cotton in the mess and trying to convince people that it's cotton candy when actually it's literally cotton. But I don't know. I can't help feeling that it sort of satirizes more than just the kind of war profiteering. That there's something about kind of modern capitalism there that is kind of just overly complicated and sort of absurd, and that, I don't know, that maybe you get a sort of element of that with Nog. And obviously the Starfleet characters of course they don't understand it. They live in a post-scarcity economy. They're not used to trading for things. We see very basic trades with other cultures occasionally, but they're not used to this kind of elaborate notion of commerce somehow.
About that, at least at a higher level, because in order to deal with other cultures that have money, there must be some way in which the Federation is converting whatever energy surplus into something they can trade for, say, latinum, so that, you know, the crew members on DS9 have latinum or something like that. But they're not used to, at their own level, dealing with that. But there must be something like that going on at a big, but is it that level. Complicated? Because what I know what you mean. I'm just saying, like, when we see it, it's usually like, okay, we'll give you. It all seems very straightforward, doesn't it? It's like, we'll give you these, whatever they are, something reclamation, something, you know, some tech device basically, and in exchange we'll get this quantity of dilithium or this quantity of, you know, it's like one thing for one thing. It's always very straightforward, and it doesn't seem that complicated. Whereas in the real world, you know, if you look at, I mean, you know, we're going through all this at the moment with Brexit and everything, the kind of enormous complexity of all these kind of trading arrangements and, you know, tariffs and you know, and the extent to which historically here in Britain, we've had all these kind of agreements about, you know, when you know, let your land lie and don't grow anything on it, and all these kind of, do you know what I mean? The kind of just elaborate nature of real world economics, you know, even over things like that are basically goods, let alone when you're talking about shares and kind of these sort of imaginary instruments and things like that. I don't know. It's sort of, to me, I suppose it's a kind of fine line from the absurdity of the details to the kind of absurdity of the ungraspable, almost impossible system, that the system that is so elaborate that really no one can comprehend it, even Milo or Nog, you know, that there's something that ultimately can't be grasped somehow. Yeah, I mean, although, you know, in seeing what Milo's doing in Catch-22, especially when he talks about, you know, buying something for a higher price than he sells it, it literally makes no sense. But what Nog's doing, I think, like when you watch the episode, it makes a certain amount of sense. Like, this person wants this, so I'm going to trade that, and this person wants this. Yeah, I think it becomes a little elaborate, but it's not something that it's impossible to understand. Like, you know, not impossible, but like in our own world, there are things that people are, you know, buying and selling and trading that don't really exist, like futures, like you're speculating on the future price of something. Like, what is that? Right? or some of these like really complex financial instruments, or bundling mortgages or stuff like that. That, you know, we've created these things where people can have some benefit, but a lot of times people don't understand what it is, which can get you in a lot of trouble. Right. But yeah, I can see how what Nog's doing could get a little complicated, but those are, I think, real physical things that he's trading. So it's easier for me to grasp, I guess.
There's that great episode right at the beginning of DS9 and again, it's the B plot, I think, in the episode Progress, where Jake and Nog, it's where they set up the No Jake consortium.
Oh, yeah.
Which again, is sort of weirdly reminiscent of Milo Minderbinder has his M&M Enterprises, right, which is stamped on, like, all his planes, but he has his own fleet of planes, you know, aside from, you know, the
and he's
armies.
Replacing medical supplies and saying, like, M&M Enterprises needed this, you know.
Exactly. Yes, the parachute silk has been used for, you know, for some, because he needed a supply of silk for something, so no one has any parachutes anymore. But it reminded me, though, in that episode of, they do all these trades for all these things. They got their self-sealing stem bolts and their, you know, whatever it is. And then they end up buying land. And Jake is like, oh, this is great. You know, land is, you know, he sort of knows his history. Like, land is worth something. I mean, even in the world of Star Trek, land is worth something because, you know, you have people who need a planet to live on, or they need somewhere to live. But Nog is just like, what's land? You know, that's just Earth. That's worthless, basically. What are we supposed to do with land? That's not a commodity that he understands. Presumably Ferengi doesn't have a, you know, population problem or anything. And land is not at a premium. But I don't know. I just thought that again, it's kind of interesting, that idea of, to us, that seems so basic that land is valuable in a sense. But to Nog, it was just like, yeah, well, what do I want with that? You know, that's worthless. Although in the end, of course, in that story, it turns out the land happens to be in the way of some proposed development or whatever, and they can almost name their price to sell it on to the government. So there's that kind of weirdly, they do end up making a big profit out of it in the end, despite that.
There was actually one thing I wanted to mention if we're talking about Treachery, Faith, and the Great River and in the cards. So in the cards is interesting because basically the Jake and Nog story is really the A plot, and what's going on with, Cisco and the Kai and I think Wayun's there is kind of the B plot, which is really unusual. So it's clear the focus is on this thing that that in the end raises everybody's spirits. Whereas in Treachery, Faith, and the Great River, it became really clear, rewatching it, the part with Nog and the trades is actually it's not only the B plot, but it's a fairly small part of the episode. It may only be like a third of the episode. The other 2/3 has to do with Odo, meeting up with Wayun 6 that's trying to defect and all of this stuff that's going on. I've heard some people say, like, that's a really weird episode because there's this really serious, important stuff, and you find out that the founders have this disease for the first time. There's like consequential stuff that's going on in that part of the episode, and then there's Nog doing these trades to get the gravity generator and all that. Maybe it feels like it's a little bit tossed off, but I actually really like that it's a part of that episode because, I mean, the two plots don't really intersect, but I think there is something about what's going on with the trades that Nog has and the comic relief that's provided that's actually a nice kind of counterpoint to the really serious stuff where literally someone's life is at stake and there's important things that are happening in the plot. But I wondered how well it works for you because it is something that's a very different structure than in the cards, which we've talked about.
And I would say, I think one of the criticisms that people sometimes make of DS9 is that the A plots and the B plots are often totally unrelated. Whereas in some ways in Next Gen, there might be, often if you think of like a kind of, especially a sort of typical Michael Piller story, somehow there would be a symmetry between like the seemingly inconsequential stuff. Often say he would write these episodes where there's like a scene on the holodeck or something at the beginning that somehow relates to the theme of the show or something. Like there's a kind of there's a structural tidiness somehow. Whereas in the case of Deep Space Nine, partly because they were moving maybe towards more serialization, towards a more almost what you get with soap operas, where you get kind of different strands being picked up here and there, and they're not necessarily going anywhere within a given episode. They're kind of just a step on the way within a certain story. And I do see what you mean, that in the case of Treachery, Faith, and the Great River, they don't really have that much to do with each other. I mean, in the cards, I'd say it is an interesting story because it is almost a story where the A and the B plot have been flipped, because there is this kind of serious story going on with the Kai meeting with the Dominion and this kind of whole thing about the non-aggression pact and all that sort of thing, and the Dominion kind of gearing up for sort of political machinations and so on. And one of the things that I think works quite well about that episode is that it does all tie together because, Jake and Nog sort of wander from, if it were the other way around, it would be that they'd wandered into the A plot from their B plot. But in fact, they're wandering from their A plot into the B plot. the two end up together and they end up, in the hands of Wayun and having to explain themselves to him. And I think that's quite unexpected in a way, because suddenly they find that there are stakes by that point. He might kill them, or who knows what might happen. Do you know what I mean? The drama does kind of ramp up a little bit, if in a slightly mad way. I can see the criticism with Treachery, Faith, and the Great River that the two are very separate. On the other hand, I read someone was arguing that the title of that episode they felt was deliberately ambiguous because the three elements, Treachery, Faith, and the Great River, they saw as potentially applying equally to both stories. And the reason they said that was, that obviously there's treachery on Nog's part insofar as he basically betrays O'Brien's trust by taking this authorization code and doing all these awful things with it, and then seemingly disappearing on a runabout. And everyone's like, is he coming back? Or is he doing, like in Catch 22? Spoilers, sorry, for the end of Catch 22, the main character, Yossarian, basically goes AWOL and makes a run for it. And actually one of the moments that is very effective in the film is the last shot of the film is you see him getting into a little inflatable dinghy and again sort of absurdly trying to row his way sort of out of harm's way, basically trying to row himself to neutral territory so he can kind of quit the forces. But so there's treachery there, there's faith obviously in both storylines, and I'd say that is the kind of unifying thing, is that for Odo and Wayun there's this discussion about Odo being a god and Wayun's religious belief and so on. And for Nog, there's this kind of religious belief in the Great River and so on. And then there's the Great River itself, which it hadn't occurred to me, but the Odo and Wayun story takes place on the Rio Grande, runabout, and the Rio Grande means Great River.
Yeah,
so there is literally,
huh.
which maybe does seem like too much of a coincidence to have not been put in there as a little, motif or something. So anyway, so that was one theory that I read, that basically the two stories, they might seem like they have nothing in common, but somehow the title sort of ties them together, as well as this idea of faith, of course.
I think even so, for me, even if something is unrelated, as long as the A and the B plot are both done well and I enjoy watching it and, it provides something good for the characters or moves them forward, I actually don't care if it's not related, because life is like that, right? There are different things that are going on for different people that know each other, and they don't necessarily connect up right away or all the time. There are just these separate bits that are happening, and I'm actually glad that it kind of worked out the way it does. Although I do wish a little bit that there was more of like the Nog story, because it's very entertaining, but
it is.
I actually don't mind when it doesn't connect up, but if it connects up in the title and the theme, all the better.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. No, I mean, I agree with you. And I think, assuming that you're watching this show from week to week or whatever, it doesn't really matter so much. I mean, when it's a shame, I think, is what does happen sometimes in Star Trek, where you get an episode with a really weak A plot and a really strong B plot. And as a result, people don't go back to those episodes. I'm thinking, for example, the episode Meridian, is it, where Dax has that romance with the guy? Which is an awful A plot, like really unappealing episode to go back to. The B plot is Jeffrey Combs's first Star Trek episode.
Yeah, that's what makes it worth it.
That great story where, I mean, really seedy, nasty story, but, he plays this really fantastic guest character, sort of villain. And this is the one where he's trying to get Major Kira's likeness to use in his kind of hollow porn program, basically. And it ends up with that hilarious shot where it's Quark's head instead has been superimposed. I mean, as a story, that B plot is great, but it's unfortunately saddled to a really awful A plot, and therefore in an episode that no one is going to remember fondly. So at least in this case, I think both the A plot and the B plot work very well, and people generally like both sides of the episode. So in a way, it doesn't really bother me either that they don't necessarily tie up all that much.
But that's true. Yeah. If you have the A plot and you're not into it, or it doesn't work, and then the B plot is something you want to see more of, that's really a shame. Yeah. And I think Meridian is probably one of the weaker DS9 episodes overall for that. But
maybe finally we could just sort of, before we wrap up, I'm just thinking about sort of Nog in general and these episodes. I mean, I think particularly I saw Aaron Eisenberg was saying he particularly appreciated Treachery, Faith and the Great River because it kind of put Nog in a more, I guess it puts him in the driving seat in a way. It's sort of, he's the kind of...
He's very confident throughout the episode,
He's very confident. He's very confident and competent as well. I mean, he really, he pulls it off just sort of against the odds. And I'm kind of thinking it's interesting that with Nog, you've got the Ferengi, he starts off as this kind of typical Ferengi kid, he's always in trouble. He's the bad influence that Sisko wants to keep Jake away from. Then he becomes, the Starfleet cadet. He's very kind of patriotic. He's very kind of earnest, sort of ideal Starfleet material in a way. But it's quite nice the way they managed to bring back this sort of wheeler dealer, sort of roguish side. And it made me sort of think about these wheeler dealer characters, these kind of characters who, and I don't think this is the case with Nog. I mean, I think Nog is a very likable, a very sort of lovable character anyway. But, the fact that a lot of these other characters we were looking at, whether it's Hawkeye, whether it's Milo Minderbinder, whether it's Del Boy and Only Fools and Horses, whether these kind of characters who are kind of working the system, working the people, kind of always up to something or other, that actually there's something quite appealing about them. And I think that's true. Weirdly, even Milo in Catch-22. I mean, Milo is true, like on paper, a truly awful person. He's a war profiteer. People get killed because of the decisions he made. We talked about he removes the parachutes from the plane so people don't have parachutes. He's running ads on Lord Haw-Haw's radio show. So, basically aligning himself with absolute treachery, and in the Second World War.
And he even enlists like Nazi fighter planes, right?
Yeah, he does. He's enlisting German planes. I mean, he's bombing his own people. He's absolutely shameless profiteer. On the other hand, there is this sort of sense that he is sort of a genius. And I suppose in terms of the novel, because in the novel you have this mad situation and different characters are trying to escape the war one way or another. So, maybe they're trying to pretend that they've gone mad. They're trying to fake. I mean, the whole idea of Catch-22 is that it comes up in various forms, but the most kind of straightforward one, I suppose, is this idea that, you can be sent home from the war on grounds of insanity, but anyone who says they want to be sent home from the war couldn't possibly be insane because the only insane thing is to want to stay in the war. And that's the kind of catch-22 of the title. So there's that kind of idea that everyone is sort of trying to escape one way or another. So whether it's Yossarian kind of, literally kind of going AWOL at the end, or, the other character, or who's kind of successfully done that, or other characters who are finding ways to sort of escape from the mad strictures of the situation they've been put in. In some ways, Milo is quite an impressive character, because he is absolutely, he's made it work for him. Do you know what I mean? He's like, he's not just going along with it. He's certainly not following orders. He's worked the system to this kind of ridiculous extent. And as much as we can see him as a kind of villain and a profiteer and a really sort of nasty piece of work in a way, and totally, it's not that he's evil. He's just totally amoral. He has no interest in patriotism, in the rights and wrongs of anything. It's all about commerce. It's all about money. But at the same time, I think he's quite an appealing character in a different sense, because he's so, there's something quite refreshing about it. It's also, it's so extreme, and it's so kind of, he has a lot of agency. He has a lot of, and a lot of ingenuity, and all these kind of qualities that, we do appreciate in someone like Nog. We like the fact that he's running rings around O'Brien, and, as mad as all this seems, and as much chaos as it seems to be causing, we sort of appreciate those qualities. And I'm just curious. I think there is something that we do love about those slightly roguish characters, and it makes him more interesting than, say, a kind of straight down the line character. It makes him more interesting than like a Wesley Crusher or someone like that who, is very earnest and nice and decent, but kind of just plays by the rules. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Actually, I want to go back a little bit to what you said, because in For Want of a Boot, the Mesh episode, Hawkeye is kind of doing these trades, but in the course of the show, he's not usually the one doing that. Usually it's Radar. You saw in the season 4 episode, which is, I think he does a better job of it. So he's actually more of kind of the wheeler dealer. But
right.
Hawkeye is definitely like a rogue, definitely rebellious. There's different episodes where he's definitely going against orders or trying to do things in the service of saving someone's life that maybe he's not supposed to. But like in the case of Milo, like I think one of the things that really stands out is, maybe with one exception where he buys the entire Egyptian cotton market and doesn't know what to do with it. Otherwise, he is completely in his element and knows what to do, knows how to get out of the worst situations. Because like after he bombs his own outfit, like there's this whole investigation, but somehow he turns it around so that people see him as doing like the patriotic work of the country. Like in a way, like he's the villain, but he's also like a heroic figure in the novel, because when everyone else, just about everyone else, has their doubts, is insecure, paranoid, or whatever, he is the most confident in that whole novel. And Nog does have a ton of confidence in Treachery, Faith in the Great River. It's like, don't worry, Chief, I've got this. It's only a rumor, but it's from a reliable source. No worries. And like, and Sisko calls O'Brien to his office toward the end, and O'Brien's like, oh, I'm going to get it now. And like, Nog's just there polishing the desk, like, everything's cool. I dealt with it. And like, doesn't this desk look great? Like there's something about his confidence in that, but it actually contrasts a little bit in the cards where Nog is really uncertain about spending the money to buy this card, really uncertain about this trade or how crazy this guy is. And Jake and Nog kind of stumble around a little bit and happen to get lucky in it, and it works out. But, the later episode in Treachery, Faith in the Great River, it's like his ultimate moment to show that he has supreme confidence in this area of trading. And there is something that you love about that. Whereas in the cards, there's something you love about them kind of stumbling around and still working it out.
I think partly in the cards, they still feel a little bit like kids. And, obviously we've grown up with these characters to some extent. I mean, they've grown up in front of us. Obviously, for some of us, literally growing up, with them at the same time. And in the card sort of feels like, I guess because Jake says all this stuff about this is, I want to pay my dad back for everything he's done for me. And obviously we know that he's done something big for Nog, he's enabled him to enter Starfleet. There's this kind of idea that it's almost a sort of coming of age story, I think, for them to kind of give something back. And they are still kind of bumbling through it a bit, and they are still a bit kind of, it's sort of an adventure. It has that feel of like, kids going on an adult adventure, to the extent that when they do wander into Weyoun, or, Weyoun kidnaps them at the end, it's very much like, oh, we're suddenly, like I said, not so much we're in the A plot, but we're like in the adult story. We're in like the real DS9 story, as opposed to the kind of lower deck story in a way. Whereas I guess in Treachery, Faith in the Great River, Nog is absolutely, I think he's an ensign by this point. But so he feels by this point, I can't remember where this falls in terms of like, the whole storyline with him losing his leg and it's only a paper moon and all of that, which obviously is also in the 7th season.
Yeah, I think it's before that.
Right. Okay, fine. But even so, he seems quite confident. He seems like, he's a junior officer, but he is very much, he's there as an adult. He's there, if we hadn't known Nog as a kid, if you know what I mean, we would accept him as this new young guy, in the same way as we're accepting Ezri Dax as this new young counselor or whatever. He feels more in his element, I suppose. And I think, and that's, one of the things that's nice about that episode and about that storyline is it does really, in some ways, his characterization in that story harkens back all the way to the 1st season, as I say, and, the No J Consortium and all this kind of wheeler dealer stuff that he was doing even then. But at the same time, he feels like he's doing it very much as a Starfleet officer. And yes, he's going to bend the rules and he's going to do things that no one else would consider doing. But at the same time, it is all for the right reasons. It is all, in a way, he is doing his job and he's going above and beyond what's expected of him, and he's going to really produce the goods by the end of it. And he probably will get promoted for that kind of behavior in a way, because he's made himself a sort of invaluable member of the crew.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, it's been fun talking about Nog and MASH and Catch-22, and particularly fun for me going to, start on this journey of experiencing MASH, which I'd never seen before. So thank you, Justin. Thank you for coming on the show, but also thank you for kicking that off. And I'm kind of aware just from the response when I put a tweet out, saying that we were going to be talking about this, the number of people who wanted to hear, a primitive culture episode all about MASH and the whole of MASH and all 11 seasons and so on. Maybe at some point further down the line we'll have to have you back on, but that might be a year or two for me to get through that kind of a viewing.
There's
especially
episodes.
since I don't think, maybe if they put them on Netflix that might help, because I've got that on my iPad. I can kind of blitz through those, but we'll see. So maybe sometime in the future. But in the meantime, it's been great fun talking about this sort of smaller focus and looking at these DS9 episodes as well. But before we go, why don't you give our listeners an idea of where they can find you on social media, and if they want to get in touch with you and hear more of your thoughts on DS9 or even on The Next Generation, which I guess is kind of your patch as far as Trek FM is concerned.
Yeah, so you can find me elsewhere on Trek FM, co-hosting Earl Grey. That's with Amy Nelson and Richard Marquez. We have a great time talking about The Next Generation every week. And you can also find me on Twitter. I'm at TrekFan4747, where I tweet about nothing but Star Trek. And you can also find me hanging around the Babel Conference on Facebook. So whether it has to do with Star Trek, any iteration, any movie, or whether it has to do with MASH, you can feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to talk about it.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for joining us. It's been great to have you.
Thank you. It's been wonderful to be here.
Well, it's been fun talking to Justin about MASH and Star Trek and trading our thoughts back and forth on those various subjects. But that's not all we've been doing on Trek FM this week. So here's a listen to what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Primitive Culture, a look at history and culture through Star Trek.
I remember the freedom of having my own car, and believe it or not, I actually had a Plymouth Fury. It wasn't a 58, right?
No way.
It was a 73, but yeah, my first car was a Plymouth Fury, and the movie was part of the reason why. When I saw that for sale, it was a cheap car. I paid like $500, $300, something like that for it. It was in really
Brandon,
good shape.
you really didn't take the message of this movie. You went out and bought one of those cars.
It was yellow. It wasn't red, so.
Who knows? Someone might have sprayed it.
Standard Orbit.
We recorded most of the Shatner episodes. Every now and then we missed, like, okay, we'll get it next round with Nimoy. We kind of thought it'd be the same thing. It's like, oh, there's going to be no difference. It's just Spock reading it instead of Kirk. No, completely different, right? So it's like, oh, crap. We should have bought 160 tapes instead of 80 for this.
Literary Treks.
I did like the scenes with his family and Riker, spending the night at the home, getting up in the morning, having breakfast with the family. Oh, look, they made him coffee. There was just something really nice and settling about Riker just being in that situation and being treated with such respect and with arms around him, just welcoming him and making him feel at home. And I guess you don't really feel that all that often in many Star Trek stories when you beam down to a planet and you're just welcomed into somebody's home and you're just seeing what a normal, happy family is like.
Warp 5.
That's kind of how Trip acted, though, right? He needed to see this. He needed to actually step in to the situation, and I appreciate that. You know, like a lot of people give him some flack for being kind of pig-headed, or I think they even almost assume that he has a problem with the three genders, and he's like, no, I don't have a problem with the three genders. I have a problem that this third sex. I guess they get it wrong. Enterprise, the writers should have said sex the entire time. They should have said sex, but I'm guessing, you know, they're on TV, and if they say sex a whole bunch, they might get the wrong idea.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published.
And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation on the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up.
If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
Primitive Culture is brought to you by Duncan Barrett and Clara Cook. You can find Duncan Barrett on Twitter at Barrett's Books. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC.
If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details.
Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM.
We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our associate producers here at Primitive Culture, Tony Black and Amy Nelson. Tony was one of the founders of this show, and we still keep him in the loop about what we're doing. You can find him on Twitter at @AJBlackWriter, and online hosting about a dozen other podcasts on everything from The X-Files to classic cinema. Amy is the host of two shows on the Trek FM network, Earl Grey and The Edge, and you can find her online on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson.
You're blended all right.